Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. We've had really good luck this year that Alexander Graham Bell has not interrupted us, but I'm going to remind you to turn off your phones or your walkie-talkies or whatever might beep in the middle of Barry's talk. We always want to thank the Godnick for hosting us, for the wonderful help we get here and the accessibility, so give your thanks. We have had a wonderful and terrifying problem in that our registrations have just blossomed. And so I emailed yesterday and told Burlington to not let anybody else register. I'm terribly worried that we might be turning people away who registered for the whole series. So I feel stupid saying this, but don't encourage your friends who haven't been coming. We just, we can only seat 100 people in here, and one time last season we had some people sitting in the living room and they could see and hear okay, but it's not ideal. So I also would like to reiterate that we welcome new members to our committee. We have a couple who are contemplating retirement, so we really need some new blood. So please talk to some of the people on the committee. I always have them wave. Where is everybody? They're all back there. Clara Hughes, Bonnie, a couple are not here today. But please talk to us about what it involves. It's a lot of fun, and obviously by the attendance, it's pretty darn popular. Next week we are welcoming VINS, the Vermont Institute of Natural Science, and they're going to bring some, I believe, raptors, birds, anyway, live birds. So don't wear any gaudy headgear. And then also I'm going to ask Barry, when we get to questions and answers, if he would please repeat a question from the audience so everybody can hear. Barry and his wife Barbara have lived in Shrewsbury, Vermont since 1977. Barry was admitted to the Vermont bar in '72 and practiced law until he retired in 2015. He was Rutland's first public defender and a longtime member and past president of the Rutland County Bar Association. Growing up in Bennington, Barry was regaled by the tales of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys and Seth Warner, and so when he moved to Shrewsbury, he was naturally drawn to the Crown Point Road Association, which was established in the 1960s to keep the history and the trails open to people and to inform anybody who was interested in that part of Vermont history. Members of the association plan and lead outings along the sections of the route each year, and Barry went on his first outing in 1999 after reading about it in the Things to Do of the Rutland Herald. So don't stop reading your Rutland Herald. There are gems there. It combined his love of Vermont's hills and history. So Barry welcomes any opportunity to share what he's learned over the years, and we're the lucky receptors of that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Can you hear me okay? Good. Well, Kathy gave a pretty good overview of why I'm here. And why don't we get started? When I first moved to Shrewsbury, I learned about the Crown Point Road because it goes through Shrewsbury, but it wasn't really until my daughter graduated high school and went off and we had an empty nest that Barb and I started exploring it, and I immediately became fascinated, and that was more than 25 years ago. So it, as Kathy said, it combined my love of hiking and history and Vermont, and so here we go. Hopefully I remember how to do this. Good. So some basics about the Crown Point Road. It dates back to the French and Indian War in 1759, 1760. That's when it was originally marked and cut, and we'll talk about that as we go through. It was also again used as a military road during the American Revolution, and we'll talk more about that. And perhaps most important, it was used, the route that many of our earliest Vermont British settlers came here and settled. So it has that history and that importance to people in Vermont, including myself. A bit about the Crown Point Road Association. As Kathy mentioned, around the road was built originally in 1759, so around 1959, when the bicentennial was coming up, a number of Vermonters with an interest in history in all the towns along the route said, wouldn't it be nice to band together to do something to celebrate and memorialize the road? And so they started up, and the organization really got going in the 1960s. There were many people from Rutland who were involved with that. One of them was Elaine Purdy, that many of you remember, who did a wonderful job. She just turned 100 and is still plugging along, has a sharp mind. And what the association does is we first of all promote interest in the road and try to do presentations like this to spread the word about the road. The association also in the summer months holds outings on pretty much a monthly basis. When I started, there were a lot of hikes. Nowadays we're doing more car tours just because it's easier. We get more people on car tours than we do on 5-mile hikes. So you probably can all appreciate that. If you Google Crown Point Road, you will come to our website, which is crownpointroad.org. We are now in the process of putting together we have a spring mailing. We've put together our outing schedule for this coming season. I have a few paper copies here. If people are interested, it'll be posted online soon. I also, if you're interested, have some membership forms up here. If you're interested, membership is $5 for the year. I don't know, does anything $5 for a year? And if you give us your email address, we have a wonderful Secretary Dale Christie who lives in Proctor, who does monthly blurbs in advance of the outings, reminding you what's going on, and shares a lot of links to other matters of interest in Vermont history, and especially as we're celebrating the 250th here. You can, if you're interested in all history, it's a bargain for $5 to get those emails and see what they show. So that's my plug for the association. So what we'll do today, we'll start off with the big picture, the geography and the prehistory review. We'll then talk about the French and Indian War when it was first marked and cut. We'll talk about some settlement between the wars. We'll talk about the American Revolution, and then we'll turn our attention specifically to Rutland County. I've got some slides of this area that may be of interest to you, I hope, and we'll go from there. One of the things that always fascinated me growing up was in 1609, Samuel de Champlain, who many of you know started coming up the St. Lawrence River earlier and established Quebec and went on to establish Montreal and so. And in 1609, he came up the Richelieu River to Lake Champlain, which he named for himself, and also talked about those green mountains on to the east. And in that same year, Henry Hudson sailed from the southern end and came up the Hudson River past present-day Albany and was probably about 20 miles from where Champlain was, and about the same, and they probably didn't have a clue whether one or the other what they were doing, but certainly the Native Americans knew that, and the routes that are sort of blocked off in orange on the map to the right show that great path. It was a war path and a traveling path in times of peace. Essentially, you could go from, if you were starting in the south from what is now New York City, you could travel up the Hudson. You could then, with a short jump, you could get over to Lake Champlain, go all the way down the Richelieu to the St. Lawrence River and out, and then there's also the Mohawk River that would head it over toward Lake Ontario as well. So those were known by the Native Americans for thousands of years, and the Europeans, the explorers, started learning about them in around 1600 or so. And again, I always feel kind of bad about talking about it as a road that was built by the British in 1759, because it was a route that's been here for 12,000 years, really, since the last ice age, when the ice receded and Native Americans moved into this area. Somebody has posted on YouTube a series called the 12,000-Year-Old Road of Vermont. So if that is of interest to you, you might check Google out and take a look at that. It talks about how the first Native Americans, again, as the glaciers receded, proceeded over this route from Lake Champlain to the Connecticut River. And there are, all along the road, there are various examples of native settlements. This picture here, I gave a presentation in Springfield last month, so this is a picture from the Connecticut River in Springfield, showing a Native American settlement there, about going back to 1100 in the Christian era. There's also sites on Lake Champlain, the Mount Independence we'll talk about. The Native Americans knew and used for chert, for their to make tools, and also in the area of Crown Point, there are also Native American settlements going back, and along the Otter Creek right here in Rutland County as well. There are numerous examples of the Native Americans, so let's please give our tribute to them as well as we go through today. So we talked about 1609, and in the 100 years or so that followed, settlements started encroaching. For the French started exploring and settling from the north. You see some dates here. They started with Quebec, they got down to Montreal, and then they started going up the Richelieu River and established in the 1660s several forts along that river there, and eventually made their way down into Lake Champlain with their settlements and their forts. And here are two of the ones that play a prominent role in the Crown Point Road. In the 1730s, 1731, the French established a settlement where we now call Chimney Point. And there's a depiction of that on the left here. And then 3 years after that, they began construction of Fort St. Frederick on the opposite shore, what we now call Crown Point. And that was a huge fort with a huge tower that you could see for miles as you sailed down or up Lake Champlain. You could see it rising there. And that really gave the French in those decades a foothold when there were conflicts between the British and the French and their Native American allies. The French had that jumping off point on Lake Champlain that they could use to go south to places in New York and Massachusetts mainly, and other places. So those were established as early as 1734. And meanwhile, if you approach from the other, well, I guess I went backward, excuse me. On the other way, is the settlers were coming in, first of all, from the east, from Boston and such parts, but also up the Connecticut River. And here are some of the settlements that came along, starting at the bottom, Springfield, and you worked your way up to Northfield, Fort Dummer, and eventually Charlestown, which was then called Number 4, the township Number 4, which was first settled in 1740. Now when I was growing up in Vermont, I learned a saying, you can't get there from here, and you can always get there from here, but it's not always easy. So I like these two maps. On the right here, this is a map of waterways, and if my pointer works, you can see on our side we have the Otter Creek, which rises down around Dorset and then works its way up through Rutland County into Addison County and empties out into Lake Champlain. On the Connecticut River side, you had the Black River, which rises on the east side of the Green Mountains and then works its way down, coming out into the Connecticut River in present-day Springfield, and of course with Charlestown across the river. So the Native Americans knew these rivers and would use them to get about. It was easier than traipsing through the wilderness. And the other trick is the mountains. And again, we know about the spine of the Green Mountains. If you notice that spine of the Green Mountains, there is one spot right here where it's the path of least resistance to get from the east side of the state to the west side of the state. And that little path is where the Native Americans went, where the French went, and where the British went after as they were building Crown Point. So you may wonder why they went where they went, but the geography answers that question for you. So moving forward, we mentioned earlier about Fort St. Frederick at 1734. Soon thereafter, the British settlers established a fort at Number 4, which was called the Fort at Number 4, and that was built there in 1774, in part in times of war, when the French and their Indian allies would come down that route that we're talking about. They'd get to the Connecticut River about there, and that fort was meant to intercept them and perhaps keep them from going further south in terms of raiding parties. So that was what it was like in 1744. There was another war, an earlier version of the French and Indian War back in the 1740s, but that's sort of setting the stage for the French and Indian War. And there you go, there we are. So we've talked about Fort Number 4 down here on the Connecticut River. We've talked about Crown Point up here. By 1775, when the French and Indian War began, the French had also built a second fort down here at what we call Ticonderoga, but the French called it Carillon. And the main battleground, if you will, was that route we showed you earlier, up the Hudson River, and the British the British forces at that point went up as far as Fort Edward, and which is right here. There was then, and this was used by the Native Americans as well, what they called the carrying place. And what you would do is get out here, which is about as far as ships could go north up the Hudson. You would then carry over to the head of Lake George, as the British called it, and then work your way down. And then there was a river, the Lachute River, runs down into Lake Champlain there. So this was the battleground, the main battleground during the French and Indian War. So it began, we'll fast forward to 1759, and at that point, Jeffrey Amherst was in charge. He brought a force up the Hudson River, up Lake George, and the French at that time decided to retreat. So they evacuated Fort Ticonderoga, or Carillon as they called it. They evacuated Fort St. Frederick and retreated up down the Lake Champlain into Canada. So Amherst arrived at what he decided to call Crown Point, and he did several things there. One of the things he did of most importance to us is he ordered a road to cut to New Hampshire, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But he also had some troops stay there at Crown Point and build a British fort there, much bigger than the French fort was, and the remains are there for those of you that have seen it. Some of his troops he sent over to Lake Ontario with help with battles over there. He also dispatched Major Robert Rogers, who had the Rogers Rangers and a group up to Canada to attack Odanak, St. Francis, the village of St. Francis, where the Abnaki were. And then a fourth group he had ordered to cut the road over to Fort Number 4. And the first orders were given in August, and the commander for that mission was John Stark, who we have heard about, one of our Vermont heroes and New Hampshire heroes. He ordered Stark and sent 200 Rangers to go to Number 4 and cut that road. Stark said, I went, and then he came back about 4 weeks later, September 9th, he got back and said, I've done it. It's about 77 miles. So, and that's a pretty good estimate, actually. So that was the first cut, and he was back in October. So Amherst was excited. So he, up until that point, if you were coming from the Boston area or Rhode Island, you would take essentially the Mass Pike going west until you got to Albany and the Hudson River, and then you'd go up the Hudson River along that road I'd previously described. But Amherst had a plan for sort of cutting the corner and saying, let's just go, instead of going north-south and east-west, let's go southeast and through what is now Vermont. He wanted the road widened and straightened to at least 20 feet, to lay bridges where necessary, to lay them sufficiently strong to bear carriages, and by that he meant gun carriages, and also very importantly, every 15 miles, he said, build a cattle pen, because one of his major concerns was not so much getting troops to Crown Point, but getting food to feed them. So he wanted cattle to come up from Boston. He made arrangements, and again, before the year was out, 5 droves of cattle were driven up the Crown Point Road as it was then cut over that new road up to Lake Champlain. So that was a very important reason for the road, at least as a military matter. Here are a couple of notes from one of the soldiers that was on that November cutting. You can see they left Crown Point. They got down about 10 days later to Otter Creek, spent several days building a bridge at Otter Creek. They finally left Otter Creek 16 days later, and then 5 days after that, they were at Number 4. They didn't do much cutting, I don't think, once they got over the mountains. They were tired and they wanted to get home. So that was what one soldier had to say about it. And one of the reasons we know about the road is because of journals such as these. That was 1759. The war was still going on in 1760. So what Amherst had, the New Hampshire regiment under John Goff, that started out over around Litchfield, New Hampshire, had them build a road coming, essentially going to the west. He went to Litchfield, got to Keene, and then eventually got up to Number 4, a road that was already built. Then those troops spent about a month in the area of Charlestown and Springfield. They built a blockhouse. There was a ferry they put up there to get troops across. There were some primitive ferries by then, but Amherst wanted a strong ferry and a strong blockhouse built there. And then he started heading toward the Green Mountains. The original road from 1759 is marked here in green, and I'm not sure if you can tell where this is. This is Cavendish or so. The Green Mountains are essentially here. Here's Lake Rescue. This is Route 100. So what Goff did was start cutting a little bit more to the north. But they got about as far as the Black River ponds, and they got word from Amherst, stop building a road and come get us, because we're heading into Canada and we're going to knock out the French, and indeed they did in 1760. So that was pretty much the end of the use of the road as a military road, and it laid a couple of primitive paths for people to follow. So here we are. We're talking about settlers. This slide is from last month. There were 26 families that moved to Springfield, which was not that far away. It took longer to settle Rutland County, but settlers began moving into these parts starting in the 1760s. And we'll talk about that in a minute. this is an interesting to me at least. One of the things researchers have found was an almanac by Nathaniel Ames out of Boston for 1773. And one of the entries he had was a table of several pages saying if you want to go from here, Boston, to Montreal, here's a route you can take, and here are inns or taverns you can start and stop at along the way. So I haven't copied all of them, but I've copied some here, starting in Keene up to Walpole, and some of these names you may remember: Bellows from Bellows Falls, Knott's Ferry in Springfield. There was a Stevens family there. Spofford and Wethersfield, Payne and Coffin are familiar names. And then you get to the Otter Creek side. There was a tavern there, or an inn run by Button. In Rutland, there was an inn run by Meads. And in Pittsford, there was a tavern run by Waters, and we'll talk more about them a little later. But this is an important historic document that shows by 1773 not only were people living in these places, but some of them had taverns and were putting up people going through. So we'll talk about some of those in a bit here. Okay, so since this is the 250th, we'll take a minute to talk about the American Revolution. It started in 1775, as you know, with Lexington and Concord. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold captured Fort Ticonderoga. The troops proceeded into Canada, which didn't go so well. Remember Baker, the Green Mountain Boy, was killed. Ethan Allen was captured. So eventually the Americans didn't succeed in taking over Canada that year, but they did manage to take over Lake Champlain. So 1776, the revolution began. As I said, at this point, the American forces had succeeded in driving the British off Lake Champlain, but they knew the British would be back, and they had to make a plan. The French, when they built their primary fort, as we talked about at Crown Point, but for tactical reasons, the American generals felt it would be smarter for them to build their major fortification at the site of Fort Ticonderoga, further about maybe a dozen or so miles south of Crown Point. So they built the fort was already there on the New York side, and on the Vermont side, they had troops there. They had 10,000 troops stationed there in 1776, waiting for the British to come down. And it was originally called Rattlesnake Point, I think, or Rattlesnake Hill, but after the word of the Declaration of Independence was read, they renamed it Mount Independence, with the name it bears today. So as expected, Guy Carleton did come down Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold's Navy had a skirmish with him up at the Battle of Valcour Island. Eventually, Carleton made it down as far as Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. There was a boom across to block traffic, block shipping. Carleton looked at it, decided it was late enough in the year, and decided to go back to Montreal. And so the Americans, thanks to this fortification, bought a year of time, and that was certainly helpful in terms of the success of the American Revolution. There was talk about building a good bridge over Otter Creek at that time, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So here's a map that Joseph Wheeler prepared of this area. You can see this is Rutland here. We're right about here. And the original route of the Crown Point Road is the one you see in red here. It crossed the Otter Creek down here in 1759, then worked its way up the west side of Otter Creek, all the way up to Crown Point, which is up here. In the American Revolution, when the Americans decided to hold their stand here, there was something called the tie branch. They would come up the road that was already marked, and then they would cut over due west to Ticonderoga. And in 1776, 250 years ago this fall, General Gates ordered another road to be built directly from Rutland up to Mount Independence through Hubbardton, and that was accomplished in 1776, and maybe we'll talk about that later. Then 1777 came along. The British came back. This time the American forces under General St. Clair decided to evacuate Fort Ty and Mount Independence. The Americans retreated. The British followed them. There was the Battle of Hubbardton that July, the Battle of Bennington that August, and then ultimately the Battle of Saratoga, where Burgoyne's supply lines had been extended and he hadn't received any help, and he surrendered his northern army. And that was a good start for the American campaign in 1777. And then over the next couple of centuries, several things happened. Once the army surrendered and the American Revolution settled, then people really started to move to Vermont in earnest. And starting in the 19th century, there were a few markers that were placed along the route. This one was placed in 1860 up in Shoreham at a place called Camp Stony Spring. Elias Hall dedicated it to his father, who had fought in the French and Indian War and came down through and had stopped there. There was also this very early dedication marker put in Clarendon in 1808 for Colonel Waite, and I'll talk more about that later. In the 20th century, local chapters of the Daughters of American Revolution started erecting markers along the road, and we'll talk about some of those, as well as some towns. And then, as we talked about earlier, finally in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, the Crown Point Road Association got involved and has kept up those markers and added to them. Another important thing the Crown Point Road did was make a list of all the markers, a book about them and how to drive to them, which was first published in 1965 and has been through several editions since then. So let's take a look at some places in Rutland County. This picture on the left is from about 1900, from my hometown of Shrewsbury. There weren't too many people there in 1900. You can see how everything was cleared. This is the road. This is looking in Shrewsbury Center, looking east. Some of you may have your bearings. When I arrived here, this was and still is called the Crown Point Road in Shrewsbury. This was called the Crown Point Inn. So when I moved there almost 50 years ago, I said, Crown Point Road, I guess maybe I should find out more about that. And here I am 50 years later. And this slide on the right, Dr. George Marshall took a number of slides, maybe some of you have seen that are held now by the Rutland Historical Society. I was going through those, and here's a picture from 1916, and that sign says Crown Point Road. So somebody had marked that. I don't know where it is. I'm guessing it's Shrewsbury, but I don't know. I'd love to find out. Anybody recognize it? In any event, this road, although it was called the Crown Point Road in Shrewsbury, it wasn't the original Crown Point Road. The original road was over a little bit to the south, over this way. But things happened on the Crown Point Road as settlers moved in. Roads would move to accommodate them and where they were settling. And this road in particular, I guess I'm having trouble putting this on with this on as well. Over the hill, lived a Nathan Russell, who moved to Shrewsbury around 1790. He built a log cabin there, which they said was the Crown Point Road, so that suggests to me that by 1790 or so, the road had moved to accommodate this route. It had shot over into Plymouth, and other settlers came here as well. The original settler in Shrewsbury was a person named Lemuel White. White was not there at the beginning of the American Revolution, but he was there in the fall of 1776 when troops began returning home over the Crown Point Road. He had established a place and a farm and a tavern there that troops would stay at. They didn't give it very good reviews. One soldier wrote, "White has but poor entertainment for both man and horse." A neighbor of his, the second settler, was Smith, Nehemiah Smith, excuse me, who lived next door. Eventually acquired the property of Lemuel White, and his family lives there still. They've lived there for generations. Julianne Smith Sharrow, who's a big member of the DAR, lives there now with her family, and her sons and grandsons live there as well. So that's a 10th or 11th generation family living along the Crown Point Road that first moved there in 1780. Lemuel White, the innkeeper, died in 1813 of the spotted fever, which was a fever that went through Vermont. Some of you may have looked that up. I looked it up this morning just to try to refresh my recollection, and there was an article in the Rutland Herald about it just this month. And in Vermont, 6,000 folks died of the spotted fever. About one in every 40 people in Vermont died of that spotted fever. It was after the War of 1812, and troops coming back to Vermont or wherever they went were spreading the fever with them. And that's a little bit of a side story, but perhaps relevant. Lemuel White was a bit of a curious guy. I guess he had an in. One of the things he was accused of is stealing from James Meade, that we'll talk about later. He stole a watch from him allegedly and was convicted of doing that. So he was a bit of a character, but he was the first settler and was there for the troops going through in 1776. So this again is sort of a close-up of the Rutland area, Rutland and Clarendon. Hope you can get your bearings. Here's Route 7. Here's the new Route 4. So we're up here. This is where we are here, Woodstock Avenue. Again, as I mentioned, the original road crossed down here below Mill River High School, and then went up the west side of the creek through Proctor and on. Those changes were made that I talked to you about earlier, the road, there was an inn here which was established around 1775. It wasn't in that 1773 almanac, but it was there in 1775. And then it came up through Rutland. At that point, there was a Fort Rutland here at the top of what is now West Street and Main Street. And then it proceeded there down to the banks of the Otter Creek. And by that point, James Meade was there. Had a ferry to go across, and indeed in 1776, at the orders of Gates, a bridge was built at that point. So how do we know this, or why do we think this? We talked about the settlers coming in. One of the surveyors that New York's dispatched was a guy named Will Cockburn. And I know when I grew up with stories of the Green Mountain Boys, the stories would go that somebody would go tell Ethan Allen, "Hey, Will Cockburn is out surveying up in Pittsford or up in Clarendon," and then the Green Mountain Boys would get up there and shoo him away and say, "Go on, we don't want you New Yorkers settling this place." But he did do a map of a town that was going to be where we are, called Socialboro. It was a New York charter, never fully settled. But he did do a survey of it and kept track of where the Crown Point Road was this was 1767. And one of the things you'll note down here is this dotted line marks the number 4 road, which is the Crown Point Road. And for me, this does two things. This is Lake Nineveh over that way. In 1776, the road cut this side it went over to Plymouth this way, but this map clearly shows it didn't go over to Plymouth that way. It continued down to the southeast. And the second thing this road shows is that the road crossed the Otter Creek down here in Clarendon, right about here, and then the dotted line continues up the west side of of Otter Creek. So it's research like this that has been fascinating to me and others. Also, some of you got here by Route 7. Route 7 was originally called Cockburn's Line. And when he surveyed, he laid out that line, and when people settled, it was marked. Why not use it? So Route 7 and heading down was surveyed by Cockburn back in the day. So here's a couple of markers in Clarendon. This one is the Waite Monument. Some of you, I hope, have seen that. Can you raise your hands? Yeah. Okay. Some of you haven't. If you haven't, it's in a field in Clarendon, not far from the library or the Grange Hall in North Clarendon. Waite was an interesting guy. He grew up in Brookfield, Massachusetts, on the road between Boston and Albany. He was one of 7 brothers, and during the French and Indian War, he was very young, but people would go back and forth, going to the war, going back and tell him and his brothers about the war. So he actually did join, and I'm sorry, I misspoke. He actually did join in time for the French and Indian War. He was on that expedition to Odenac, St. Francis, and basically after the raid was completed, it was every man for himself trying to get back to the British line, the American lines, British lines. Waite was part of a party that came down the Connecticut River. They were hoping that somebody would leave them supplies, but they didn't. But Waite shot a deer, and he was hailed by his compatriots. And there's the Waite's River in Bradford, which is named for Waite in honor of his saving the party by killing that deer and giving them sustenance on their way back to Fort at number 4. Waite then fought again in the American Revolution. I mentioned earlier the Battle of Valcour and Benedict Arnold's Navy. Waite was part of that expedition. One of the cannon on his boat misfired, and he was struck by a splinter from the cannon, was very badly wounded. His troops, as a testament to how loved he was, attempted to get him back to his home, which was in New Hampshire at that time. He didn't make it. He made it as far as Clarendon. There was a Fort Hill there, and he passed away in Clarendon in 1776. And it's a real testament to him that they put this up for him in 1908. And you can see what the inscription is. So that is still there, and one of the earliest markers, one of the earliest markers on the Crown Point Road for sure. An interesting character who this is another marker. This is in what's now called Pierce's Corners. It's on Route 103, the old Route 7, back before the day. This Joseph Smith had an inn there by 1775, and the Green Mountain Boys used it. While he was there, a John Bowman, who was a veteran of the French and Indian War, came up and settled in the area, ended up marrying Joseph Smith's daughter. I don't have my glasses, so I can't read my notes as far as her name. But, and Joseph Smith sold it to Bowman in 1776, and it was under Bowman ownership for more than 50 years. Then there were a couple other people came in, and then a family named Pierce was there for another 50 years, another 4 generations or so. So it became known as Pierce's Corners locally. And this is a picture of it before it was destroyed by fire in October of 1959, which led to the formation of the Clarendon Fire Department. Here's another of those markers. This may be the marker that's sheer or resemblance, facsimile thereof. And the Daughters of the American Revolution and the local Ann Story chapter in particular were very dedicated to putting up markers along the road. And they had a ceremony. This is the stone on the left, which is stone that's on the right, which is the village of North Clarendon on the old Route 7. The Clarendon Historical Society has a program from the dedication on Flag Day, June 14th, 1914. And you can't read it, but they got all the school children around. They had an invocation. They sang songs. They had a guest speaker. It was a big deal. And then the Daughters of the American Revolution did a great job with that. And here's another marker in Clarendon that our Crown Point Road Association put up in 2002. We had some members of Whitcomb's Rangers there to mark for the dedication ceremony. And it was in memory of Al Ransom, who was a great historian. Al is the one that found that map, went over to New York State and found that map that helped us discover where the road went and where it crossed the Otter Creek, because there was a lot of dispute about that in the early days. Flora Weeks was one of our early members from Rutland, and when they started researching, she remarked, everybody knew where the road went, and everybody said it went somewhere else. and it was probably true, because it did move over time, as you've heard. And we talked about Button earlier, the Button Tavern. I wondered about that because it's not on the original route of the road. But here's an old map that's in the Clarendon Historical Society records. And Button is essentially down, this is, I guess, what you'd call Clarendon Flats, where the town hall is. On the southern part of town, the Mill River is up, well, the Mill River comes down through here, and the Otter Creek comes up through here. And the first person in Clarendon, according to research, was a Sprague, and apparently Button was the second family that arrived in 1767 or 68. So, whereas the original, well, the Crown Point Road of 1776 was up here, or excuse me, the French and Indian War Road. By 1773 or so, he was here, he opened up an inn, and so people started heading down to Clarendon Flats rather than going through North Clarendon, and stayed at his tavern there. So again, another example of how the road moved from time to time and year to year based on where people settled. So that gets us up to Rutland, and there were 2 forts here in Rutland, and these pictures are taken from the Rutland Historical Society Quarterly. A guy named Dan Pratt drew these sketches for the society based on descriptions of these forts. Fort Rutland Fort Rutland, well, is at the top of West Street Hill, at the junction of West Street Hill and Route 7, near Lindholm's Tavern back in the day. And it's there still. Has anybody ever noticed there's this big granite block there? That was put up in 1901 by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and it's still there today. So take a look next time you drive by. Another one you might want to take a look at is this marker. which the Dogs of the American Revolution put up in 1903. And this is out in center Rutland. And this is a unique marker. They call it a drinking fountain. It was a watering trough for horses. And there was a spring right here where the roads came. And they channeled the spring into a trough, into a watering trough that the horses could use as they went by. Here's an early photo of it showing where it sat. This is what is now called the East Pittsford Road. You can see the railroad tracks, and you can see the trolley back in the day. So that's where it was dedicated in 1903, and where it stayed for 50 years. But things happen. In the 1950s, the state of Vermont decided to build a new and improved Route 4 over in center Rutland. These yellow roads mark the original route, and this was that corner where the drinking fountain was. And if you've driven what is now the old Route 4, it is this red line. So what they did was they moved that drinking fountain to accommodate the new road. And where they placed it was here. I'm sure everybody in this room has driven by that marker, and probably none of you know what it is or have ever bothered to notice. So we do have Crown Point Road members who try to take care of it, but it's in a terrible location. So it's been there for 80 years, but I do have some good news to report. The town of West Rutland is trying to build a pocket park in this area. This is the Route 4. This is Meads Falls. Here's the Otter Creek. And so they are planning a pocket park here off Simons Avenue, just on the west bank of Otter Creek, where they're going to put up a lot of signage. This is one of a truly historic area, of it going back to the Native Americans who fished there. We've talked about the Crown Point Road. There was the Fort Ranger that was there as well. And hopefully that marker is going to be moved here where people can again see and enjoy it. In fact, there's a meeting of the Town Planning Commission next week to talk about what the signage might look like, and they're hoping to start work on that pocket park this summer. So there is some progress to report, and that'll be a good news for the area and good news for that poor watering trough that everybody is ignoring these days. Out that way is the Mead Tavern site. We mentioned that this is another one of those that was mentioned in that 1773 almanac. I think most of you know the story of James Mead. He was Rutland's first settler. He came up in 1769. It was a log home originally of 3 rooms by James Mead. But it was, I guess he accommodated travelers, so it became a tavern. There was probably a second iteration of it by the time of the American Revolution, but it was also on that road to Hubbardton we talked about earlier. And this marker was marked in 1912 by not only the DAR, but Governor Mead, who was a descendant, I think maybe a great-grandfather of James Mead. But that was another central location, and again on the west side of the Otter Creek. That was, again, Rutland's first settler. So let's move up to Pittsford, which was named for Pitts Ford, which is a crossing in the Otter Creek in what is now the town of Pittsford. Here's a picture of it taken a few years ago. And this, if you're going to ford Otter Creek, but any place north of Rutland, this is probably the best place to do it. So I am sure the Native Americans use it. I am sure that the French, when they were taught by the Native Americans how to get over the Otter Creek, well crossed here. And Many people back in the early days were of the mind that the Crown Point Road must have passed here as well. Again, I think we've pretty well documented that it crossed further south based on those maps I've showed you. But back 100 years or so ago, people weren't sure about that. So when the DAR dedicated a marker in 1911 in Pittsford, they put it on the east side of Otter Creek. It was there for a century. I'll zoom to the next slide. Here's a map of Pittsford. This yellow, roughly here, and this where I've marked in yellow, is where Pittsford is across the Otter Creek. And there, you easily could come down this. You could go up. This is, I guess they call it Depot Hill now, and you could continue down this way, essentially heading south into Rutland. A few years ago, we took a hike along here, and there was a beautiful causeway, for want of a natural causeway, that went right down to that creek bed that was just designed by Mother Nature for people to walk. And so it's perfectly understandable that people would have used that, and many people thought that the Crown Point Road went that way, but we don't think it did. So that marker stood here for 100 years on Depot Street, whereas what we think was that the Crown Point Road was over here on the west side of Otter Creek, and the Waters Tavern, we mentioned Waters earlier, was roughly here. So what happened was serendipitous, perhaps. The town of Pittsford didn't want that marker where it was anywhere. It was hard to find. It was hard to see anyway. So they said, we don't want it here. So the Pittsford Historical Society said, okay, we'll take it. So they moved it, and this is where it sat for a year or so outside the Pittsford Historical Society building. In the meantime, we made arrangements with the landowners, original landowners on the west side of the creek near where Waters Tavern was, and they said, yes, we'll take it. And so we with the help of the town of Pittsford, we moved it over to near the Waters Tavern. We had a nice program. We had a nice dedication ceremony, rededication ceremony. We involved the Daughters of the American Revolution, the town of Pittsford, the Crown Point Road Association, and there it is in its new location near the Waters Tavern. I have something here about Waters. Let me see if I can read it. He originally came through Pittsford. This is according to Caverly's History of Pittsford, that was published in 1872. He indicated that Waters came to Pittsford originally in 1763, liked the area, so he bought some land, and eventually moved there. According to Caverly, he settled there in 1772 with his family, and the house he had, though it was a log house, it was quite large for the period, and for several years it was kept as a public house, the first of its kind in Pittsford. And again, that's how it appeared in the Ames biography or almanac you saw earlier. So that's another example of things moving over 250 years, but that I was pleased that we could take care of that, assist with that as members of the Crown Point Road Association. Many of you know Bill Powers, who is from Rutland and also a member of the Pittsford Historical Society, and that marker being on the wrong side of the river has irritated Bill for years. So he can now rest in peace, go to his grave knowing it's where it belongs. So I think that's what I've got for slides, and I'm certainly happy to take questions or comments. I always learn something when I come to these with a lot of interested historians like yourself. So thank you and have at it. Yes?
Yeah, as far as you can tell, from beginning to end, this was strictly all military help that constructed this, or did they have any civilian assistance?
In the years it was built, it was strictly military. Because because originally in the French and Indian War, there was nobody living here other than Native Americans, and they weren't helping. And the same thing with the American Revolution. It was strictly military both times. Obviously, in between, there have been improvements that local settlers have added. In the back. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to repeat that question. The question was whether this was built by the military or by civilians, and the answer was the military.
Is the Crown Point Road Association planning anything for the 250th anniversary?
We are, yes, and I have some copies of our schedule up here, and some of those will be around that. The state is also very busy working on other festivities for the 250th. One of the things that was of interest to us was the Gates presentation, and I'm having trouble getting these glasses and the microphone on, but we'll give it a try. On September 7th of 1776, Horatio Gates was at Fort Ticonderoga. He was the commander at the time, and he sent orders to Lieutenant Colonel John Barrett saying, "You are immediately to proceed to cut the road from number 4 to the foot of Mount Independence, taking care to construct a good bridge over Otter Creek at or near the falls in Rutland." The next day, so Barrett, he was over at number 4, heading west. At the same time, the following day, he ordered a parade to start cutting from Mount Independence, heading east from the east side of Mount Independence toward the bridge now building across Otter Creek, as previously laid out by Benjamin Hickok and David Remington. There was a November 6th letter from Colonel Barrett to Gates saying that by then, 2 months later, the road had been cured and the bridge will be effectuated in a day or so. And so that's 1776. He also mentions, Barrett, that the blockhouse at the bridge is almost finished. That was Fort Ranger, and that date is 1776, which is a couple of years earlier than that 1778 date you saw on the DAR marker. So it makes sense to me that they would have built the blockhouse there in conjunction with building the bridge in 1776. I think the Vermont military headquarters was switched there in 1778, which is why that date was put in there by the DAR. Yes?
So in the American Revolution, when they carried all those armaments down from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, did that go on any of the Crown Point Road, or was that a different route?
No, that went differently, and I had that misconception myself when I was young. Speaking of the 250th anniversary, we're celebrating that 250th anniversary. Those cannon were brought, it was Henry Knox, the bookseller from Boston, who was in charge of that. What they did was they went down that route I showed you earlier. They floated up Lake George, then did that portage to the Hudson River, and then got down to Albany or so, and then headed east through Massachusetts.
They took the mass fight.
Yeah, essentially. And I think there are celebrations as we speak going on along that route this summer for the days that when he arrived at various places. But that's a good question, and I kind of thought that too when I first thought about the Crown Point Road. But that's where the cannon went. And did you guys get the question okay? I'm sorry, I missed that. Okay. Yes.
I own the markers book, and what I found was, while I was reading it, it was very difficult to locate anything. And I'm not sure whether it's just that things are so different now than when I was reading it.
Yes, it was originally published in 1965, and that was.
I think they did an update.
They've done 3 or 4 editions. The most recent edition is 2011. We have been talking about it needs an upgrade for sure. Because they refer to people that lived there 50 years ago. That's so-and-so's house, and,
You get a hold of the history of Clarendon, it's really funny because everything is referred to as the names of families' farms.
yep,
Yeah, you go down and get, so-and-so's farm, you'll find it, but
yeah.
those are gone now.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and that's, when doing research, as I do, the comment was that the book could use updating, and we want to do it. It's not an easy task. I was involved the last time we did it in 2011, and it takes a lot of manpower, a lot of hours of a lot of people, and it's on our list of things to do, is to get a new edition of the Historical Markers book. I do have a few of them here, by the way, if anybody is interested in acquiring them. I think they're on sale now for $15. So if a bargain by any price, I don't know, we should raise our prices, I guess, but if anybody's interested, I do have a couple of copies here that I could pass on to you if you're interested. Yes, in the back.
I was interested that the commander directed the soldiers to build a corral every 15
Yes,
miles.
yes.
Was that customary, or was that an innovation? I mean, I think of Napoleon outdistancing his supply lines, and he didn't want to do that. I thought that was pretty brilliant.
Well, the question's about those cattle pens every 15 miles, and I can't speak to it. I mean, logistics and feeding your army is extending your supply lines is something of great concern, and Amherst had the foresight to plan as he was doing that. Make sure you do that every 15 miles. We talked earlier about Al Ransom, and one of his missions was to find cattle pens, see where they might be located. He was pretty sure he located one in my town of Shrewsbury, very close to the Long Trail. It's a bit off the road, but it was there. There's also notions that there was another one in Pittsford on the West Proctor Road, and Proctor on the West Proctor Road. And there were some other spaces as well. I can't recall them as well, but he wanted to get those cannons up there. He was going to have people spend the winter, and he needed to feed them. So he made arrangements. I think he may have made arrangements with John Hancock's firm to get the cattle up there. That was something Hancock was in back in the day. So, and if anybody else knows anything about that, perhaps I'd welcome the information. Okay. Yes, Justin.
You were mentioning, Barry, about monuments being moved around. And the Fort Rutland Monument, way back 1941, was where it is now. But the DAR hated that new diner. They hated it so bad, they took that 2-ton monument and moved it down to the armory. It stayed there for 40 years. Finally, I talked to the Rutland Historical Society, and I said, that was stupid. Let's move it back to where it was. The Fort Rutland wasn't down at the armory, but the DAR had a lot of power back then, and that was their monument, and they hated the looks of that diner that looked like a spaceship.
Thank you, Justin.
He's Justin Lindholm, and it was the Lindholm Diner.
Right, yes, yeah. Okay. Yeah, there was, the diner was there and the sports stop next door, right? So, and happy memories. Yes?
The monument that was on Depot Road.
Yes.
Where's it now?
It is now on the west side. I can show you I can go back to the map, hopefully. Yes, the question was the marker that got moved in Pittsford from Depot Hill to the west side. The original placement by the DAR was over here, just in the suburbs of the back roads of Pittsford. There's a water, I think it's water, some sort of municipal stuff going on there. So the town wanted to move it, and you couldn't see it anyway, so we were happy that it got moved. There are people that like to go across and find all these markers, and they'd always call me up and say, we can't find that one in Pittsford, so. And now, I guess if you go, well, if you went over, well, I guess if you continued across the river here, and then you go up to Florence and past this is sort of where Omea is in this area. I think this is the railroad tracks, and Omea is right in here. So, and I wrote down the names of the owners, but let's see if I can find them.
Visible from the road?
The marker now?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it's a very back road. If you can find the road, you can find the marker. Yeah, I mean that's you can see it there, and I guess you can also see it in this picture as well. It's in a field. I'm not. Bear with me. I need my glasses. I think the people. I think the landowners are Ed and Joanne Ujair. I guess it is Whipple Hollow Road, okay. You've bicycled those many times, right? So, yeah, okay, there you go. Yeah, so, thank you. And, yes, Jay?
What's the monument that you have up here?
This monument is this was a photograph placed on a piece of styrofoam. I should pretend it's granite. And this was one that was set by the DAR in 1912. The question was, what is this marker? I believe this is one of those in Clarendon that I showed you earlier. There were two that are virtually identical that were placed by the DAR on the same day in Clarendon in 1912, and this is a picture of one of them. There are many styles and many shapes of markers. And there's about 100 along the road now, based on what the DAR did and others, and they're all sort of different sizes and shapes. This is sort of a typical marker that the DAR would buy, half a dozen of these, and the Crown Point Road has bought some of that are similar as well. But I haven't bothered to go through all the markers today. We want to get out here before the sun goes down, but they are very interesting, and next time you see one, take a look. Yes, over here.
In Sudbury, there's a marker on a very back road near Route 73 and Route 30. That's by the Sudbury School. Can I assume that that's reasonably close to the Crown Point road where the road actually was? Happened over there when we talk about back roads.
Yeah, the question was about a marker in Sudbury, and I think it was. I have the book here. If you want to come up after, we can take a look at this map, and maybe that'll help you locate that road and orient yourself to how close it is to where the road passed. There's one of the things I thought was interesting was the Crown Point Road marker book. The first edition was 1965, and after it came out, some folks from Bridport said, "Hey, we've got markers in this town that you don't have in your book." And they were out in fields that the road used to go by, but are hardly ever used. So now that you can find 64As and 64Bs and things like that, then they numbered the markers originally as 1 to 64, going from the Connecticut River over to the lake. But we found some additional ones that are A's and B's, and plus the Crown Point Road Association itself has put some up. And again, last time I counted, there's around 100 of them along the route.